Hey guys, welcome back to the Hybrid Athlete channel, and on today's episode of Sports Science Shorts we are going to talk about overtraining. This is a really important subject for two main reasons. Firstly, because as athletes and coaches we want to understand what overtraining is, and secondly, if coaches use words like an athlete is overtrained, that can then start to cause some kind of panic if they go searching for answers to a term that isn't really applicable to them. So let's talk about what overtraining is and overtraining syndrome is. Okay, so this paper here is by a good friend of mine, Lee Bells. He's based out of Sheffield Hallam University, and this is his colleagues at Sheffield. So they basically looked at coaches' perceptions of overtraining in strength sports. Okay, so that's what this paper's about here. So let's define what overtraining is, or overtraining syndrome is. So if we imagine fatigue on a spectrum, okay, so training fatigue. So we have our training stress, we have a period of recovery, we have an adaptation, and that adaptation is gaining strength or endurance performance. Now, if we get a mismatch between our training load, so the amount of stress that we're putting our body under, and our recovery, then we start to go into this what's called overreaching phase. Now, there's two types of overreaching. So you've got functional overreaching and non-functional overreaching. So functional overreaching is an intentional accumulation of training volume that the athlete then starts to fatigue from, so that when we monitor that athlete, we then dial it back, we might taper, we might deload, and then they get this kind of super compensation effect. Non-functional overreaching is when we accumulate a lot of training volume, it's not done intentionally, and then the athlete becomes fatigued, and we start to see, and these are characterized by both times short-term decrements in performance. Okay, so when people often use the term overtraining, what they are probably really doing is getting into this non-functional overreaching. Because if we look at overtraining and overtraining syndrome, this is a multifactorial, highly complex condition that ticks a lot of boxes and has a decrement in performance for several months. Now, overtraining syndrome can be caused by this mismatch between training stress and recovery, but this is just over longer periods of time, particularly if you've got long periods of intense training with periods of under recovery. Or if we look at this paper here though, what we find is that if we look across the complexity of overtraining syndrome, it's not just a little bit of fatigue. There's neurological decrements, there's endocrinological, so our hormone systems, our immune system is affected. We notice things like mood state changes, but it's really difficult to really tie down and say clinically, let's say, that an athlete is overtraining. And in this paper here, which is quite a critical paper of this idea of the overtraining syndrome, where they look at these markers that have been associated when they've looked at athletes that have had high amounts of training stress, and they've tried to look at how that is associated with overtraining syndrome. This paper's looked at overtraining syndrome in athletes and the symptoms, and saying, okay, well, where's the research that these markers actually are good, solid, long-term indicators of overtraining syndrome? So we've got this idea that it causes endocrine disruption. We've got this idea that it affects mood state. We've got this idea that it affects long-term performance. But where is the actual evidence that these can be used to identify and categorize an athlete that is suffering with overtraining syndrome? So apologies if this image isn't very clear here, but this is from that same paper, and it talks about the proposed symptoms of overtraining. And the proposed symptoms are things like reduced serotonin, higher cortisol level, changes in heart rate variability, mood state changes, reduced caloric intake, increased exercise muscle damage, inflammatory markers, reductions in bone mass, increases in body fat mass, menstrual cycle disruptions in female athletes, and in male athletes, changes in hormonal profile, testosterone levels, increased instances of infections, and other immune system markers. So that's what you can see as proposed symptoms of overtraining syndrome. But the problem is, when they've tracked athletes long term, is that there's no demonstration of these which are accurate and sensitive enough to truly say that an athlete is suffering with overtraining syndrome. But what it does mean is that as a coach or as an athlete, if we monitor our performance accordingly, and we start to know reductions in performance, and we start to look for some of these markers of overtraining syndrome, mood state, irritation, increases in illness, feeling run down, that we are going to be able to avoid overtraining syndrome if we could drive ourselves to it, and acknowledge that this is more of a non-functional overreaching phase, which we can then dial back from and recover from. The danger would really come of having like a really well-structured design training program that is so rigid and dogmatic that we can't be flexible with it if we start to notice these things. So as a coach and an athlete, we have a training plan in front of us, and that's great. But if we're not regulating that training, either through monitoring, on a session-to-session basis, or on a week-to-week or a block-to-block basis, and we're not intentionally accumulating fatigue, we're just ignoring it because we've got to stick to the program, then that's where the danger really comes in. It might not be that we ever get to this true ideal, whatever it looks like, of the markers and the diagnostic symptoms of overtraining, but still, if we think about that continuum, we don't want to be towards that non-functional overreaching end for too long, because that's where we're likely to get, if not all of the symptoms of overtraining syndrome, we are likely to get things like more injuries, more illness, and so on and so forth. So the point I'm trying to make from this entire video is that overtraining syndrome is a proposition, but it's something that hasn't been demonstrated. But also that language use is incredibly important as coaches and athletes, so that we don't just say like somebody is overtrained without really understanding what that means, when actually a lot of the time in the scientific literature, what we would probably be talking about is non-functional overreaching, okay? Now, of course, overtraining is just in the sort of common vernacular. We have to be careful with the vernacular we use with athletes as coaches, so we don't fall into the trap of putting ideas into our athletes' head, which makes them then start to sort of panic about where they are and stress about whether they're overtrained and that all these bad, awful things are going to happen to them. When the chances are that practically by overtraining, what we mean is we've just accumulated a little bit too much fatigue and we need to have a bit of a rest. Right guys, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that was moderately educational, at least a little bit informative. If you want more stuff from me, please give this video a like and a subscribe, and I'll be back with you guys very soon. And in my next Sports Science Shorts, I'm going to talk about nutrition for hybrid athletes, or concurrent training, which is basically combining strength and endurance type activities into one glorious culmination within a specific sport. Cheers guys, have a great day. Peace.